Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering stories that connect in ways you might not expect, from the surface of the moon to the flooded streets of Nairobi, from the shipping lanes of the Pacific to the ferry docks of Hong Kong. The climate crisis is reshaping everything, and tonight, we follow the money, the technology, and the human cost.
I'm Maya Clarity, and what we've uncovered this week is a pattern that keeps repeating. Governments and corporations are pouring billions into futuristic technology while communities on the front lines of climate disaster are left to drown, sometimes literally. Tonight, we're going to lay it all out, story by story, and by the end, you'll see the connections that the mainstream coverage keeps missing.
We're starting tonight with a story out of Kenya that deserves far more attention than it's getting. Then we move to Peru, where a similar disaster is unfolding. We'll examine a bold new proposal to capture carbon emissions right off the smokestacks of cargo ships. We'll look at how Hong Kong is quietly restructuring its ferry system in ways that tell us a lot about climate adaptation economics. And we close with a story about building bases on the moon, and what that says about where our priorities really are.
5 stories. 1 thread. Let's get into it.
Our top story tonight, devastation in Nairobi, Kenya. At least 23 people are confirmed dead after flash floods tore through the capital overnight on Friday. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, torrential rains hit the city late Friday evening, and within hours, major streets had turned into rivers. Thousands of homes and businesses were submerged. And as of Saturday, rescue teams were still pulling bodies from the wreckage.
Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. This is the capital city of Kenya, a metropolis of over 4 million people. This isn't a remote village with no infrastructure. Nairobi has international airports, skyscrapers, a thriving tech sector. And yet, when the rains came, the city essentially collapsed. Flights were disrupted. Motorists were stranded on highways. And the damage cut across every economic class, from the vast informal settlements to upmarket neighborhoods like those in the city's wealthier districts.
That detail is critical, Maya. We often hear about flooding in African cities and there's this implicit assumption that it only affects the poor, that it's a poverty problem. But what happened in Nairobi shows us this is a climate infrastructure problem. The city's drainage systems, its urban planning, its flood management, none of it was built for the intensity of rainfall we're now seeing. And that's not unique to Nairobi. That's a global failure.
And let's talk about who is responsible for that failure. Kenya contributes a tiny fraction of global greenhouse gas emissions, less than 0.1%. But it sits in one of the most climate-vulnerable regions on Earth. The increased frequency and intensity of extreme rainfall events in East Africa has been directly linked to rising global temperatures by multiple peer-reviewed studies, including work from the World Weather Attribution Group. So when 23 people die in a flash flood in Nairobi, the causal chain leads right back to the boardrooms of fossil fuel companies and the capitals of the world's largest emitting nations.
And here's the part that should make everyone angry. The Loss and Damage Fund that was agreed to at COP28, the fund specifically designed to help countries like Kenya deal with exactly this kind of climate disaster, has been painfully slow to disburse actual money. We're talking about a fund that was celebrated as a historic breakthrough, and yet communities are still waiting for the resources they were promised while their neighbors drown in floodwaters.
The human toll here is staggering. 23 confirmed dead, but that number is almost certainly going to rise. Rescue operations were still underway as of the latest reports. Thousands of families have lost everything. And the economic damage to businesses, to roads, to infrastructure, that will take years to rebuild, if it gets rebuilt at all. In many cases, after previous floods in Nairobi, damaged infrastructure in lower-income areas was simply never repaired.
And that creates a vicious cycle. Each flood event makes the city more vulnerable to the next one. Damaged drainage systems don't get fixed. Displaced families rebuild in the same flood-prone areas because they have nowhere else to go. And the underlying drivers, unplanned urbanization, inadequate stormwater management, and of course, accelerating climate change, none of those are being addressed at the pace required.
We should also note that Kenya has been experiencing erratic weather patterns for months. The region has swung between severe drought and extreme flooding in cycles that are becoming shorter and more intense. This isn't a one-off event. This is the new normal, and until we're honest about that, the death toll is only going to keep climbing.
Now let's move to our second story, because what's happening in Peru right now is an eerily similar situation playing out on a different continent. Southern Peru has been hit by severe flooding after torrential rains, with Al Jazeera reporting widespread damage to communities in the region. And just like in Kenya, the people bearing the brunt of this disaster are those who contributed the least to the problem.
The footage coming out of southern Peru is devastating. Streets turned to muddy rivers, homes inundated, infrastructure washed away. And this is happening in a region that's already economically vulnerable. Southern Peru includes areas with high rates of poverty and limited access to emergency services. When a flood like this hits, the response capacity is simply not there.
What connects Nairobi and southern Peru is more than just coincidence. Both events are consistent with what climate scientists have been warning about for years, that as global temperatures rise, the hydrological cycle intensifies. Warmer air holds more moisture. When it rains harder. And communities that were built for historical rainfall patterns are being overwhelmed by a new climate reality.
And there's a political dimension here too. Peru has been grappling with political instability for years now, which has made it harder to implement long-term climate adaptation strategies. When governments are focused on surviving the next political crisis, infrastructure investment and disaster preparedness tend to fall off the priority list. And it's ordinary citizens who pay the price.
This is a pattern we see over and over again. The countries most affected by climate change are often the ones with the least political stability and institutional capacity to respond. It's not a coincidence. Many of these instabilities are themselves connected to resource scarcity, economic inequality, and the legacy of extractive colonial economies that enriched the same nations now producing the most emissions.
Let's put some numbers on this. The economic losses from climate-related disasters in developing countries are estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars per year and rising. Meanwhile, global climate finance flows to these same countries remain a fraction of what's needed. The gap between what's promised and what's delivered is a moral chasm, and people are dying in that gap.
In both Kenya and Peru, we're watching the same story unfold. Communities that have done almost nothing to cause the climate crisis are paying the highest price for it, while the global response remains woefully inadequate. And that brings us to a question that our next story raises in a very different context.
Exactly. Let's shift now to an investigation into one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions that most people never think about, the global shipping industry. According to a detailed report from CleanTechnica, researchers and industry players are asking a provocative question: can we capture carbon emissions right at the funnel of a cargo ship?
This is a fascinating and important story. The shipping industry is responsible for roughly 2 to 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and if it were a country, it would rank among the top 10 emitters in the world. For years, the industry has resisted meaningful decarbonization, arguing that the technical challenges are too great and the costs too high. But now, a technology called onboard carbon capture and storage is being floated as a potential solution.
Here's how it works in theory. You install carbon capture equipment on a vessel that chemically scrubs CO2 from the ship's exhaust gases before they leave the smokestack, or funnel, in maritime terminology. The captured carbon is then stored on board in some form and offloaded at port for permanent storage or utilization. It sounds elegant. But the CleanTechnica analysis raises serious questions about whether this is a genuine climate solution or an expensive distraction.
The key barriers are significant. First, there's the energy penalty. Running carbon capture equipment requires substantial energy, which means the ship burns more fuel to power the capture system, which partially offsets the emissions reductions. Some estimates suggest the energy penalty could be 15 to 30%, meaning you need significantly more fuel to travel the same distance.
Second, there's the storage problem. Where do you put all that captured CO2 on a ship? Carbon dioxide, even when compressed or converted to a liquid, takes up significant space and adds weight. On a cargo vessel where every cubic meter and every ton of carrying capacity translates directly to revenue, the economics get very challenging very quickly.
And third, and this is the one that really matters from a climate perspective, the infrastructure for offloading and permanently storing captured CO2 at ports around the world simply does not exist. You would need a massive global build-out of CO2 receiving facilities, pipelines, and geological storage sites. We're talking about decades of construction and trillions of dollars of investment.
So here's the critical question: is onboard carbon capture a serious decarbonization pathway, or is it a way for the shipping industry to delay the transition to genuinely clean fuels like green hydrogen, ammonia, or wind-assisted propulsion? The CleanTechnica report points out that shipyard order books are currently full of fossil-powered vessels. The industry is still building ships designed to burn oil for the next 20 to 30 years. Onboard carbon capture could be used to justify those orders by claiming that emissions can be dealt with after the fact.
And this is where we need to follow the money. Who benefits from the narrative that we can keep burning fossil fuels and just capture the emissions? It's the same players who have always benefited: the fossil fuel producers, the engine manufacturers, the shipping companies that don't want to invest in genuinely new propulsion technologies. Carbon capture on ships is, in many ways, the maritime version of the same argument the oil industry has been making on land for decades.
That said, we should be fair. There are legitimate researchers working on this technology who genuinely believe it could play a role as a transitional measure while green fuels scale up. The reality is that the shipping industry can't flip a switch and go zero emission overnight. But the danger is that transitional becomes permanent, and carbon capture becomes a reason to keep the status quo rather than a bridge to something better.
The evidence-based assessment in the CleanTechnica piece makes it clear, the barriers to onboard carbon capture at scale are substantial, and the technology should not be used as an excuse to slow down investment in zero-emission vessels and fuels. The climate doesn't care about our transition timelines. It only cares about how much carbon is in the atmosphere.
And let's connect this back to Kenya and Peru. Every ton of CO2 that goes uncaptured from a cargo ship contributes to the warming that makes flash floods deadlier, droughts more severe, and communities more vulnerable. The shipping industry's delay on decarbonization has a body count. It's just that the bodies are in Nairobi and Lima, not in the boardrooms of shipping conglomerates in Copenhagen and Geneva.
That's a point that cannot be made strongly enough. Now, let's turn to a story that at first glance might seem like a local transportation issue but actually tells us a lot about the economics of climate adaptation. Hong Kong authorities have proposed adjusting ferry fares for 6 routes starting April 1st, according to the South China Morning Post. Some single-journey fares would rise by as much as 12.5%, while certain high-speed trips would actually become cheaper.
Alright, so why are we covering ferry fare adjustments in Hong Kong on a climate show? Because this story is a perfect case study in something that every coastal city on Earth is going to face: how do you keep essential, low-carbon transportation systems financially viable in a changing economy? Ferries are one of the most energy-efficient ways to move people across water. They're a critical part of Hong Kong's transit network, connecting outlying islands to the urban core.
The Transport Department's proposal, submitted to the island's district council, explicitly framed this as a balance between residents' travel needs and the ferry's financial viability. That language is telling. These ferry operators are struggling. And if they go under, the communities that depend on them, many of which are on islands with no other practical connection to the mainland, lose their lifeline.
This is the climate adaptation dilemma in miniature. We need low-carbon transportation to survive and thrive. But low-carbon transportation often operates on thin margins, especially when it's competing with heavily subsidized road and air infrastructure. Ferries don't benefit from the massive highway construction budgets that governments pour into car-centric infrastructure. They're expected to be self-sustaining in a way that roads never are.
And look at the specifics of this proposal. It's the first fare revision in nearly 3 years. During that time, fuel costs have fluctuated, labor costs have risen, and maintenance expenses have increased, all while ridership patterns have shifted post-pandemic. The operators are being squeezed from every direction. A 12.5% increase on some routes might sound steep, but when you haven't adjusted fares in 3 years in an inflationary environment, you're really just playing catch-up.
The interesting wrinkle is that some high-speed trips are actually getting cheaper under this proposal. That suggests the authorities are trying to incentivize certain travel patterns, perhaps shifting demand toward routes or services that are more efficient to operate. It's a form of demand management through pricing, and it's actually a pretty sophisticated approach to transit planning.
But here's the bigger picture. Hong Kong is one of the wealthiest cities in Asia. If even Hong Kong is struggling to keep its ferry system financially viable, what does that say about less wealthy coastal cities around the world? What about the island communities in the Philippines, Indonesia, or the Pacific Islands that depend entirely on ferry services? If the economics don't work in Hong Kong, they certainly don't work in Fiji.
This connects to a fundamental challenge in climate policy. The transportation systems we need most for a low-carbon future, ferries, trains, buses, cycling infrastructure, are chronically underfunded compared to the systems driving emissions. Governments spend orders of magnitude more on highways and airports than they do on public transit and maritime transport. Until that funding equation changes, we're going to keep seeing stories like this one, where essential low-carbon services teeter on the edge of financial collapse.
And there's a climate justice angle here too. The communities most dependent on ferry services in Hong Kong are often the lower-income residents of outlying islands. A 12.5% fare increase hits them harder than it hits a mid-level executive choosing between the ferry and a helicopter transfer. Climate adaptation costs, like climate impacts themselves, fall disproportionately on those least able to bear them.
Exactly right. Now, Alex, let's get to our final story of the evening, and it's one that takes us quite literally off this planet. According to IEEE Spectrum, researchers are developing laser-based 3D printing technology that could be used to build future bases on the moon as part of NASA's Artemis program.
This is a remarkable story about human ingenuity. The basic concept is this: instead of launching all the building materials for a lunar base from Earth, which would be prohibitively expensive, you use the materials already present on the moon's surface. Lunar regolith, essentially moon dust and rock, would be fed into a laser-based 3D printing system that sinters or melts it into structural components. You're literally building with moonrock using laser printers.
The research featured in the IEEE Spectrum piece highlights work being done to refine this process, looking at how lunar regolith behaves when subjected to high-powered lasers, how strong the resulting structures are, and how the technology could be scaled up for actual construction on the lunar surface. It's cutting-edge material science, and the engineering challenges are genuinely fascinating.
But here's where our journalistic instincts kick in, because we have to ask the uncomfortable question. At a time when 23 people just died in flash floods in Kenya, when communities in Peru are being swept away by climate-driven rains, when the shipping industry is stalling on decarbonization, and when even wealthy cities like Hong Kong are struggling to fund basic low-carbon transit, is this where our resources should be going?
It's a fair question, and it deserves a nuanced answer. Space research has historically produced enormous spin-off benefits for life on Earth. Technologies developed for space programs have led to advances in materials science, water purification, renewable energy, and dozens of other fields. The laser-based 3D printing being developed for the moon could absolutely have applications for disaster-resistant construction on Earth, for building in extreme environments, for rapid infrastructure deployment after floods and earthquakes.
That's true, and I don't want to dismiss the value of this research. But we also need to be honest about the scale of investment involved. NASA's Artemis program has a budget in the tens of billions of dollars. The entire Global Loss and Damage Fund for climate-vulnerable countries has struggled to mobilize even a fraction of that. When we can find tens of billions to build habitats on the moon but can't adequately fund flood defenses in Nairobi, we have a priorities problem.
And there's another layer to this. Who benefits from lunar construction technology? In the long run, it's going to be the nations and corporations with the resources to exploit space: the United States, China, the European Union, SpaceX, Blue Origin. The countries losing people to climate floods right now are not going to be building moon bases. The technological frontier is expanding, but it's expanding for the few, not the many.
That said, there's an argument that solving the extreme engineering challenges of building on the moon pushes us to develop technologies that can help everywhere. If you can figure out how to 3D print a structure using nothing but local materials and sunlight in the vacuum of space, you can certainly figure out how to build flood-resistant housing in a developing country. The question is whether those technology transfers actually happen, or whether they stay locked behind patents and profit motives.
And that's where governance comes in. Public research funded by taxpayers, through NASA, through university grants, through government contracts, should produce public benefits. If laser-based 3D printing technology developed for the Artemis program can help communities adapt to climate change on Earth, then there should be explicit mechanisms to ensure that happens. Technology transfer shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be built into the program from the start.
Well said. Now, let's pull all of these stories together, because the connections between them tell us something important about where we are as a civilization in 2026.
Here's the pattern we see across all 5 stories tonight. The climate crisis is accelerating. The floods in Kenya and Peru are not isolated events, they're symptoms of a global system that is breaking down. The atmosphere holds more moisture, the rains are more intense, and the infrastructure built for a stable climate is failing.
At the same time, the industries most responsible for driving that crisis are dragging their feet. The shipping industry is exploring onboard carbon capture not primarily because it's the best solution, but because it allows them to keep burning fossil fuels. Shipyards are still filling their order books with conventional vessels. The transition to green fuels is happening far too slowly, and carbon capture is being positioned as a reason to delay rather than a bridge to accelerate.
Meanwhile, the economics of climate adaptation are brutal. Hong Kong, one of the richest cities on the planet, is struggling to keep its ferries running. If the financial model for low-carbon transportation doesn't work there, imagine the challenges facing less wealthy cities. We're building a world where the clean alternatives to fossil fuels are systematically underfunded while the fossil fuel infrastructure keeps getting built.
And then there's the moon. We have the technological brilliance to figure out how to 3D print buildings on another world using lasers and moon dust. That's extraordinary. But that same level of ingenuity, that same level of funding, that same level of political will is conspicuously absent when it comes to protecting communities from climate disasters right here on Earth.
The fundamental issue is priorities. We're not lacking in technology. We're not lacking in knowledge. We know exactly what's causing the climate crisis, we know who's responsible, and we know what needs to be done. What we're lacking is the political and economic will to redirect resources from the systems that are destroying the planet to the systems that could save it.
And that's where each of us comes in. The decisions being made right now, about shipping regulations, about transit funding, about space program budgets, about climate finance for vulnerable nations, these decisions are being made by people who answer to us. To voters, to consumers, to citizens. The question is whether we're paying enough attention to hold them accountable.
23 people died in Nairobi this week. Communities in Peru lost their homes. Cargo ships keep belching carbon into the atmosphere. Ferry operators are going broke trying to provide clean transportation. And we're figuring out how to build on the moon. These stories are all connected by a single thread, the choices we make about who matters, whose problems get solved, and whose suffering is acceptable.
At Truth Report, we believe no one's suffering is acceptable. We believe the people of Nairobi and southern Peru deserve the same ingenuity and investment that we're putting into lunar construction. We believe the shipping industry needs to be held to account for its emissions now, not after another decade of delays. And we believe that keeping low-carbon transportation alive isn't a luxury, it's a necessity.
That's our show for tonight. If these stories matter to you, share them. Talk about them. Demand better from the leaders and corporations that shape our world. The climate crisis isn't coming, it's here, and it's killing people right now.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth. Stay informed, stay critical, and never stop asking who benefits when the truth gets buried.
I'm Maya Clarity. We'll see you next time. Until then, keep